Hi, I'm Rashonda Cade. This is Reading with Rashonda. We are reading Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. We are going to finish Chapter 11 today. Chapter 11 has been a three-part journey, but we are finishing it today. Returning to Mr. Lincoln's room, I found her in a new paroxysm of grief. Robert was bending over his mother with tender affection, and little Tad was crouched at the foot of the bed with a world of agony on his young face. Because it's got to be horrible. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. That's just got to be awful. I shall never forget the scene, the wails of a broken heart, the unearthly shrieks, the terrible convulsions, the wild, tempestuous outbursts of grief from the soul. That is a lot of grief. Like, you know how if you've experienced it personally or if you've seen it in a movie or something, like people are just bawling and wailing at the side of a coffin. No, no. That's what I'm picturing here, except for they're not at the side of a coffin. I bathed Mrs. Lincoln's head with cold water and soothed the terrible tornado as best I could. Tad's grief at his father's death was as great as the grief of his mother, but her terrible outbursts awed the boy. I bet they did. I would be terrified. If I'm a young kid and I just see my mom just screeching, like I would be so scared. Sometimes he would throw his arms around her neck and exclaim between his broken sobs, "Don't cry so, Mama, don't cry, or you will make me cry too. You will break my heart." Mrs. Lincoln could not bear to hear Tad cry, and when he would plead to her not to break his heart, she would calm herself with a great effort and clasp her child in her arms. Every room in the White House was darkened, and everyone spoke in subdued tones and moved about with muffled tread. The very atmosphere breathed of the great sorrow which weighed heavily upon each heart. Mrs. Lincoln never left her room, and while the body of her husband was being borne in solemn state from the Atlantic to the broad prairies of the West, she was weeping with her fatherless children in her private chamber. So she did not go on tour with President Lincoln's body as he went across the country. I guess they embalmed him. Like, I know embalming existed back then. Was he on ice? Like, ice would be impractical back then. I guess he was just embalmed, and they did the best they could. She denied admittance to almost everyone, and I was her only companion except her children in the days of her great sorrow. There were many surmises as to who was implicated with J. Wilkes Booth in the assassination of the president. A new messenger had accompanied Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln to the theater on that terrible Friday night. It was the duty of this messenger to stand at the door of the box during the performance and thus guard the inmates from all intrusion. It appears that the messenger was carried away by the play and so neglected his duty that Booth gained easy admission into the box. Mrs. Lincoln firmly believed that this messenger was implicated in the assassination plot. One night I was lying on a lounge near the bed occupied by Mrs. Lincoln. One of the servants entering the room, Mrs. L. asked, "Who is on watch tonight?" "The new messenger," was the reply. "What? The man who attended us to the theater on the night my dear good husband was murdered? He, I believe, is one of the murderers. Tell him to come in to me." Oh, snap. It might be about to go down. The messenger had overheard Mrs. Lincoln's words through the half-open door, and when he came in, he was trembling violently. She turned to him fiercely. "So you are on guard tonight? On guard in the White House after helping to murder the president?" "Pardon me, but I did not help murder the president. I could never stoop to murder, much less to the murder of so good and great a man as the president." "But it appears that you did stoop to murder." "No, no, don't say that," he broke in. "God knows that I am innocent." "I don't believe you. Why were you not at the door to keep the assassin out when he rushed into the box?" "I did wrong, I admit, and I have bitterly repented it, but I did not help kill the president. I did not believe that anyone would try to kill so good a man in such a public place, and the belief made me careless." I was attracted by the play and did not see the assassin enter the box. But you should have seen him. You had no business to be careless. I shall always believe that you are guilty. Hush! I shan't hear another word, she exclaimed as the messenger essayed to reply. Go now and keep your watch, she added with an imperious wave of her hand. With mechanical step and white face, the messenger left the room, and Mrs. Lincoln fell back on her pillow, covered her face with her hands, and commenced sobbing. So the whole time we've been reading this little section, I've really been thinking, why are they sending a messenger to guard? Like, perhaps messengers had more functionality than I think of a messenger right now, but like a messenger isn't the person who guards, it's Secret Service. I don't know if they had Secret Service then. I'm guessing they didn't. Maybe this was the start of it, but I was like, even like, I don't know, somebody in the military or somebody I would think would be the guard, not a messenger. And I'm not trying to downplay messengers, they're important people. And oh, I just thought of the phrase, don't shoot the messenger, but okay. All right. Robert was very tender to his mother in the days of her sorrow. He suffered deeply, as his haggard face indicated, but he was ever manly and collected when in the presence of his mother. Mrs. Excuse me. Mrs. Lincoln was extremely nervous, and she refused to have anybody about her but myself. Many ladies called, but she received none of them. Had she been less secluded in her grief, perhaps she would have had many warmer friends today than she has. Hmm, I get that. People need to be able to feel like they can help and share in somebody's grief, but at the same time, if this is how you're grieving, this is how you're grieving. But far be it from me to harshly judge the sorrow of anyone. Could the ladies who called to condole with Mrs. Lincoln after the death of her husband and who were denied admittance to her chamber have seen how completely prostrated she was with grief, they would have learned to speak more kindly of her. Often at night, when Tad would hear her sobbing, he would get up and come to her bed in his white sleeping clothes. Don't cry, Mamma. I cannot sleep if you cry. Papa was good, and he has gone to heaven. He is happy there. He is with God and Brother Willie. Don't cry, Mamma, or I will cry too. The closing appeal always proved the most effectual, as Mrs. Lincoln could not bear to hear her child cry. Tad had been petted by his father, but petting could not spoil such a manly nature as his. He seemed to realize that he was the son of a president, to realize it in its loftiest and noblest sense. One morning, while being dressed, he looked up at his nurse and said, "Pa's dead. I can hardly believe that I shall never see him again. I must learn to take care of myself now." He looked thoughtful a moment, then added, "Yes, Pa's dead, and I am only Tad Lincoln now, little Tad, like other boys. I am not a president's son now. I won't have many presents any more. Well, I will try and be a good boy, and I will hope to go some day to Pa and Brother Willie in heaven." He was a brave, manly child, and knew that influence had passed out of their hands with the death of his father, and that his position in life was altered. He seemed to feel that people petted him and gave him presents because they wanted to please the President of the United States. From that period forward, he became more independent and in a short time learned to dispense with the services of a nurse. While in Chicago, I saw him get out his clothes one Sunday morning and dress himself, and the change was such a great one to me. For while in the White House, servants obeyed his every nod and bid, that I could scarcely refrain from shedding tears. Had his father lived, I knew it would have been different with his favorite boy. Tad roomed with Robert, and he always took pride in pleasing his brother. After the committee had started west with the body of the president, there was quite a breeze of excitement for a few days as to where the remains should be interred. I'm also wondering, like, when they had to get out of the White House, because they're talking about like they're in their rooms. Um, are they in their rooms in the White House? Did whoever was vice president immediately take over? I should know my history better, but like, it sounds like they're still in the White House, but I would think the new first family would be moving in. And then if they don't live in the White House, where do they live? Where do they go? Yikes. After the committee had after the committee had started west with the body of the president, there was quite a breeze of excitement for a few days as to where the remains should be interred. Secretary Stanton and others held frequent conferences with Robert, Mr. Todd, Mrs. Lincoln's cousin, and Dr. Henry, an old schoolmate and friend of Mr. Lincoln. The city authorities of Springfield had purchased a beautiful plat of ground in a prosperous portion of the city, and work was rapidly progressing on the tomb when Mrs. Lincoln made strenuous objection to the location. Hmm. She declared that she would stop the body in Chicago before it should be laid to rest in the lot purchased for the purpose by the city of Springfield. She gave as the reason that it was her desire to be laid by the side of her husband when she died, and that such would be out of the question in a public place of the kind. As is well known, the difficulty was finally settled by placing the remains of the president in the family vault at Oak Ridge, a charming spot for the home of the dead. After the president's a charming spot for the home of the dead. The dead do not care if their spot is charming. That is for the rest of us. After the president's funeral, Mrs. Lincoln rallied and began to make preparations to leave the White House. One day she suddenly exclaimed, "God, Elizabeth, what a change! Did ever woman have to suffer so much and experience so great a change? I am not taking anything away from the devastation that Mrs. Lincoln surely must be feeling, mm, but she's not the only person to have ever had to go through such a change. When I am thinking about people who were stolen from Africa and everything they endured, like on the continent of Africa, before they even got on a boat, the hardship of the boat to somewhere in the Americas, depending on where they went, uh, that's quite a change that a lot of women had to endure. Okay, let me crawl off of my high horse and get back to reading this book. I had an ambition to be Mrs. President. That ambition has been gratified, and now I must step down from the pedestal. My poor husband, had he never been president, he might be living today. Alas, all is over with me. Folding her arms for a moment, Folding her arms for a few moments, she rocked back and forth, then commenced again more vehemently than ever. My God, Elizabeth, I can never go back to Springfield. No, never, until I go in my shroud to be laid by my dear husband's side, and may heaven speed that day. I should like to live for my sons, but life is so full of misery that I would rather die. And then she would go off into a fit of hysterics. Hmm, okay, so she said she wants to be dead so she can be with her husband. She can't go back to Springfield, and she has suffered the greatest change that any woman has ever suffered. Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. This is re- this is what? This is Reading with Rashonda, and I'm Rashonda Cade. Until next time.